So good morning and welcome all. I'm Leslie Maitland, chair of the Amram Scholar Series. On this Super Bowl Sunday, we're delighted to offer you, dare I say, some brains before the brawn. And in Rabbi Lustig's absence, I'm honored to introduce today's speaker, Professor James Loeffler, who teaches Jewish, European, and international history, as well as the history of human rights at the University of Virginia. He's here to talk to us today about his new book, Rooted Cosmopolitans, Jews and Human Rights in the 20th Century. Among the many rave reviews it has received, the Washington Post described it as superb and an homage to the visionaries dedicated to the creation of human rights in a world too often lacking in humanity. In it, he analyzes the surprising connections between Zionism and the origins of international human rights, and discusses how the forgotten Jewish fight for human rights holds timely lessons for thinking about the intertwined futures of global justice and Jewish politics. With the birth of the State of Israel and the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights having just marked 70th anniversaries this past year, he explains how both achievements are tied together in an ongoing debate over Israeli-Palestinian conflict, global anti-Semitism, and American foreign policy. Yes, at a point when we have witnessed our own government tragically separate thousands of migrant children from their parents at our borders, and Israel's occupation of Palestine has inflamed anti-Jewish and anti-Zionist reactions around the world, Professor Loeffler's research provides important historical perspective on both movements: the Jewish-led struggle for rights owed to humanity itself, regardless of where people live, and the establishment of the State of Israel as a safe homeland for a very particular set of persecuted people. With vivid immediacy and feeling, Professor Loeffler tells this story through the lives of 5 remarkable Jewish founders of international human rights, following them from the pre-war shtetls of Eastern Europe to the post-war United Nations, a journey that includes the Nuremberg and Eichmann trials, the founding of Amnesty International, and the 1975 United Nations resolution labeling Zionism as racism. It's a truly absorbing, beautifully written, and enlightening read. The co-founder of UVA's Human Rights Research Network, Dr. Loeffler was a Dean's Visiting Scholar at the Georgetown University Law Center. Among many prestigious fellowships he has earned, he was a Kluge Fellow at the Library of Congress and a Savitt Fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He has written on contemporary Jewish politics, anti-Semitism, human rights, as well as on Jewish music, with his work appearing in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Slate, the New Republic, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, and many other publications. In addition, Professor Loeffler is a pianist and a musicologist who has consulted for National Public Radio, Carnegie Hall, and the Kennedy Center's Pro Musica Hebraica concert series. His first book, The Most Musical Nation, Jews and Culture in the Late Russian Empire, won 8 major awards and honors. For today's lecture, the Amram Scholar Series acknowledges with appreciation the support of the Leo and Elizabeth Goodman Public Issues Endowment Fund, and I'm happy to see that the Goodman's daughters are here with us today, Joan Churchill and Lois Antel. So thank you. I'd also like to note that the Jewish Book Council helped make this program possible. Now please take a moment to silence your cell phones as I present to you Professor Jim Loeffler.
All right, good morning once again. It's a pleasure to be here at Washington Hebrew to speak in the Amram Scholars Series. And it's a particular pleasure because I've long admired this community and the leadership. I want to acknowledge an old friend, former board president Hank Levine, who's here. Also, Cantor Michael Manovich is someone I've known through Jewish music work, as well as Rabbi Joshua Haberman, who first welcomed me in many years ago to teach in one of the courses that he set up through the Foundation for Jewish Studies. So it's really a treat to be back here, and I also want to thank Leslie for the wonderful, generous introduction that only a fellow author can appreciate what it takes to put a book like this together, and so thank you. I'm going to start with a joke, and the joke is about two old friends sitting on a park bench together, and one of them turns to the other, and he just looks at him and says, "Oi." And the second one pauses, and he looks back at his friend, and he says, "Oi." First one pauses again, then he says, "Oi." Second one says, "Oi." Goes on like this for a minute or two. And finally, the first one says, "I thought we agreed not to talk about Israel." So, as you already heard, this is a book talk about Israel and about human rights, and for many people that's like a double oi, right? It's a topic that generates a lot of controversy, a lot of intense passion for many people on all sides of the issue, in fact, and it's a topic that is often very difficult to talk about, and that's also something that I think we noticed in the past year. Because what this book is really about a story that was celebrated in two different ways in 2018. As you heard, it was last year the 70th anniversary of the founding of the State of Israel. There was a lot of celebrations, a lot of writing and reflection about what that meant, as well as the marking of the 70th anniversary of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Both date to 1948. But if they share a birthday or an anniversary, it is hard for many people today to imagine them as sharing that other than as a kind of strange coincidence, or even for some people a kind of cruel irony. Because Zionism and human rights, for many people inside the Jewish world and beyond, have come to be seen in a certain sense as polar opposites. So to bring you into this topic, and also to explain a little bit of how I got interested in writing about it, I want to just show you this slide. And this is, I recognize we don't have a huge screen. The visuals are not essential to this talk. But basically, I'm going to tell you what's in it. This is a collection of images from the far right to the far left, I would say, and points in between that talk about how Israel, Zionism, and human rights come together. And the best way to think about this is to say this. On parts of the left today, the political left in this country, the global left, and I only mean parts, I'm not generalizing as a whole, but at parts of the left, Zionism is viewed as, at best, kind of clannish tribalism, and at worst, racism. Israel is demonized as a rogue regime that is linked to white supremacy and police brutality. It is likened to the apartheid state in South Africa. The Labour Party in England, as you may know, has been convulsed with debates about this question of its attitude, leadership's attitude towards Israel, and the criticism of Zionism versus pure anti-Semitism. Recently, we saw headlines emerging involving Amnesty International condemning Israeli policies and basically getting into a debate about whether Jewish-owned housing units in the West Bank can be rented out through Airbnb. And Amnesty weighed in on this, and many people reacted to this by saying they should weigh in on this type of thing and raise the question about discrimination and human rights in the West Bank. And others reacted by saying Amnesty International is just anti-Semitic. And the Israeli government reacted by saying, we think we maybe need to ban Amnesty from this country. Now, that's some language you see, and we could multiply examples. I work on a college campus. I can tell you about how these debates are framed among young leftist activists today about Israel, Palestine, human rights. The interesting and important thing to note is that there's almost a mirror image on the other side of the spectrum. If on the left, some parts of the left, Zionism is demonized and treated as just racism, on parts of the right, human rights are seen as de facto anti-Semitic. And this may be news to some people, or maybe very familiar to some of you. Many people cheered when the U.S. withdrew from the UN Human Rights Council recently because they said, good riddance. That organization is hopelessly corrupt and poised against Israel. And in fact, most of these human rights organizations have an agenda which, if it's not intended to be, ends up being anti-Semitic. It demonizes the Jewish people. It doesn't provide protection for them. And many people in Israel today view human rights essentially as a concept that, whatever it once was, is clearly something that just wants to threaten Jewish security and demonize Jews. One prominent American Jewish intellectual, Ruth Weiss, a woman I know well, scholar and writer, recently gave a talk in which she said human rights is the single worst thing to happen to the Jewish people in the last 70 years. So on the right, there's a mirror image of human rights as something terrible. And I will tell you, this talk is taking place in the context of a series of talks I've given. And in some communities, people have approached me and they said, well, we have a lecture series and this sounds like an interesting topic, but we can't advertise a talk in our Jewish community that says human rights in the title. Because people will assume, they don't know anything about you, they'll assume you're an anti-Semite. So that polarization is quite striking. And this is something that prompted me basically to ask, how did we get here? Was it always so polarized? What is it in the past that led us to this point? And this book was written in a certain sense to try and answer that question. Now, along the way, the book involves a lot of different people, a lot of different characters and stories, because it turns out the story is much more interesting and much more complicated than simply one of this organization versus Israel or this constant debate. There's a lot more history in it. And I tell the story, as you heard in Leslie's kind introduction, through talking about 5 people, a whole bunch of organizations and movements and historical events, but focused on 5 people. And I called them the lawyer, the activist, the rabbi, the philanthropist, and the diplomat. And what I'm going to do for you today is talk about the stories behind the book through focusing on 2 of these people, their lives, their ideas, which can help us understand the forgotten history about Jews and human rights, as well as how we got to this complicated, controversial, and polarized moment today. I'm not promising solutions to everything, but I'm a history scholar, so I don't have to give you the solution. I want to explain how we got here, and then we can think about, maybe together in the Q&A, what this could mean for how we approach the future. Before I get into the people, though, I want to back up one step and talk about this concept of human rights. The idea of human rights has a long pedigree, right, in Western civilization in particular. And in Jewish tradition, we have many powerful ideas of justice, right, of humanity, of equality, things of this nature. But human rights as we know them, and by this I really want to make clear at the beginning of this talk, international human rights, especially as conceived of as international human rights law, this is something which really does have a much shorter history, and it has a lot to do with the moment right after World War II. That's why the 70th anniversary of the UN's Universal Declaration was such a big occasion. This was a new idea in which the nations of the world got together and said, okay, it is no longer just acceptable to say that we want to give people equality and freedom by making them citizens of states, right? You get your freedom as citizens of this country, and then we argue about what we ought to be able to do because we have a American law, but we want to have a bigger system that's going to rest on top of that. Why? Well, we just went through the Holocaust and World War II and global war, and we've seen that nationalism in particular has led countries in Europe and then elsewhere to get into these violent, horrible, genocidal conflicts. So we want this new idea of human rights for all of humanity to rest on top of it, and the UN is going to create a universal declaration and then a legal system that's going to make that into law. At least this is the idea. And so nationalism is kind of the enemy. But at the same time as that is happening after World War II, and this is sort of a retread of the intro you heard me give, there's another story in which the world and the United Nations is getting together and they're saying the best way to protect people who've experienced violence and genocide and lost their rights is to make them part of a nation state. And Zionism, of course, is that movement which says Jews need a national home, they need a nation state of their own. So nationalism is the solution, right? It's not the enemy, and in fact, the United Nations is not doing this just for Jews. They're also saying this is how we're going to solve the whole problem of India and Pakistan, right? Muslims and Hindus, we're going to divide up and give different countries to different peoples. The question of how that works is something I'll turn to a little bit later. But this is very much an obvious idea of what the UN is doing. And even those people in the Jewish world today who are very critical of the United Nations have to acknowledge that it created the club of countries and gave the legitimacy to the creation of a country called Israel. So the question, therefore, is if these two things are happening at the same moment, what's the connection? One is saying nations and nationalism end up punishing and hurting minorities, and others saying, but the best way to protect those minorities is to give them a nation of their own, a nation state. This is the conceptual thing that's going on at this point. And the question for me at the heart of the book wasn't just how do we get to this moment, it's what did Jews think about these two things? Did they see them as different in conflict? Did they see them as related? What did they think at the time? I think it's fair to assume that most of us imagine that Jews never agree on anything, right? We don't agree today. And back then, there were some Jews who said, we've just experienced the Holocaust. We want a homeland for ourselves or our relatives. And others who said, well, we've seen the the things that governments can do. Our focus, our passion is universal humanity and working for a law that will protect everybody. To put it crudely, I think the way it's often conceived of is some Jews choose nationalism. They say, we want a nation state, we deserve one. And others choose internationalism. Some Jews choose land and guns. And they say, that's how you protect yourself in a violent world. And others say, we want law and rights, and we want internationalism. So this is an image, I think, that courses through much of how we think about it today, and we think about it also in terms of universal ideals and particular realities. And then we imagine, well, they're destined to clash, right? Because these people want this, and these people want that. That, in a nutshell, as I say in the book, is the story most people imagine and tell about Jews and human rights. And it's the story I thought I was going to tell until I began to look into some of the people who actually were going through this moment and making human rights and making the state of Israel at the same point in time. And it turns out that the story is quite different. So the first person of two I want to introduce you today is this man, Hirsch Zvi Lauterpacht. So Lauterpacht is not well known, and this is a town full of lawyers, right? I know many wonderful lawyers. And most lawyers I've talked to of different generations, American lawyers, have never heard of this guy. That's because he was someone who was active in this field of international law, and much of American law, even for people who do things involving foreign relations, focuses on the U.S. Constitution and what we can do, and some treaties and things like that. But I can tell you in Europe, this person is like a demigod. He's still remembered as a hero and as the founding father of international human rights law. Lauterpacht is regarded by many as the greatest international lawyer of the 20th century. He is the man who coined the term crimes against humanity. He's the person who developed much of the legal ideas behind the Nuremberg trials. He is the person who came up with the idea of an international bill of human rights and what became the Universal Declaration, and several other things. Recently, two colleagues who teach at Yale Law School published a book in which they said that he is uniquely, individually responsible for the entire modern liberal international order. So everything that we hear talked about and argued about today, what's happening with populism, what's happening with liberal values and NATO and the UN, they say it's all thanks to him that we even have it in the first place. So the question is, where did he get his ideas about human rights, and where did he get his ideas about law, and what did he think about Jews and Zionism and all of that kind of thing? Most people who have looked at him, and he's been written about by other scholars, say, well, duh, it was the Holocaust. Here's a man born in Poland in the early 20th century who invents the ideas of human rights during World War II because he himself was persecuted, was a refugee from Eastern Europe, who fled and went first to Central Europe, to Vienna, and then to England. He lost a huge amount of his family to the Nazis during the war. And born in a Polish shtetl, as I mentioned, he rose up to be a professor at Cambridge University in England, and eventually a judge on the International Court of Justice at The Hague. So the people who've written about him normally say, well, again, Eastern Europe, Holocaust, that's all you need to know, right? He suffered, and therefore he was determined to kind of imagine what justice could mean in different terms. And because he was Jewish, he understood this, and he had no home of his own, so he thought beyond nations and nationalism towards humanity itself. Because he had been personally afflicted by nationalism, he imagined legal internationalism. And it's a very interesting story, and these are some of the writings he did, and there's a nice center. I'm going next month to speak at the center, the Lauterpacht Research Center for International Law at Cambridge University. It's a compelling story, and the only problem with it is it's not true. And I found this out as I was working on the research for this book, because I went to interview his son, Eli Lauterpacht, who was also a famous lawyer. And Eli had published almost all of his father's papers and published a biography of his father, how my father became such an important lawyer. And I went to interview him, and I said, you know, I'm very interested in your father's early years, particularly in Eastern Europe, and I happen to be someone who studies Jewish history and Zionism, and there are these mentions of his involvement with Zionism. And he said, well, you know, everybody was Zionist for 5 minutes in Eastern Europe, but I don't think there's anything else to say. And he said, if you want to take a look, there are some papers over there in Polish and Hebrew and Yiddish, but you know, I don't read those languages, and so they're there if you want to take a look. I'm going to take a nap, that's what he said. So he went in his study to take a nap, and he said, you know, you can go over there and take a look. So I went in there, and in the closet I found a different story. I found his politics and his Zionist activism. And so I did what every scholar does today, which is I whipped out my cell phone and started taking pictures. You know, I got permission and everything, but I said, I got to document this and take it home and read these documents. And what are these documents about? It turns out there's a different side to this man who was so famous for international legal ideas and for human rights. The man who invented much of what we think of as human rights law in 1948 also drafted a version of the Israeli Declaration of Independence. He's doing this at the same time. The man who dreamed up the idea of an international bill of human rights, a kind of legal charter, wrote his first legal work, his dissertation, arguing that the British mandate in Palestine, when the British took over Palestine from the Ottomans, from the Turks, and announced it was now going to be a Jewish national home, that this was a victory for the Jewish people and for international law. So this was legal and an advancement for the cause of international law as a whole. The man who inspired much of the European Convention on Human Rights, the European Court of Human Rights, spent 2 decades as the chief outside counsel, basically the outside lawyer to the Zionist movement, giving them memos, writing memos about their cause of trying to build a nation state in British Mandatory Palestine and what to do vis-a-vis all the legal questions that came up. I think the most striking example, here are some more images of his writings, is that in 1948, as he is advising the International Law Commission of the United Nations about law and how to make the world a more just place, he is also writing memos to the Israeli government about the war, the Arab-Israeli war that's taking place. And they sent him urgent telegrams saying, we need your legal advice about the war and about the laws of war and about the fight that is happening around the war over our country, which has just been created, and the Arab states who say it's illegal and it's wrong. So it turns out that Lauterpacht isn't simply a European refugee who jumps into the field of thinking about justice and human rights. He's also someone who's deeply involved in this other story of nationalism and Zionism. And it turns out, and this is the argument I make about him in the book, that it is because of his nationalism that he begins to think about internationalism. So here I want to just pause, and I apologize for those of you who it's a little hard to see, but I'll tell you what's up here. This is him as a young man. The first clip is from a headline from an article in Yiddish from 1924, describing the organization that he started. The first organization he started was called the World Union of Jewish Students. It's still around today. It was started in the 1920s to fight anti-Semitism in European universities. So this was his first cause of activism. This is a clip from a draft of the Israeli Declaration of Independence that he writes. And down here in Polish is a memo that he wrote in 1918. It's the first thing I've been able to find that he wrote. In 1918, he was basically a young man in his first year of college, university, in the town of Lemberg, also known as Lvov or Lviv in Eastern Europe. And he was present during one of the worst pogroms to happen in the 20th century. It was considered actually the worst outbreak of anti-Jewish violence basically before 1920, including everything that happened during World War I, because this was just a massive violent attack on the city's Jewish community by Polish military and by Polish civilians. And he wrote a memo in response to it where he argues for justice. And what does justice mean for him? Justice doesn't actually mean just treat us equal. He demands equality, but then he says, We are a separate national minority here in this country that is emerging called Poland. We have a different language, we have a different religion, we have different cultural needs, and after several hundred years of persecution, the only way to make us equal is to recognize our national collective identity. What does that mean? Well, it turns out that Lauterpacht is part of a movement of young Zionist lawyers in Eastern Europe after World War I who are arguing for group rights, for minority rights. Their goal is to seek a kind of international legal protection for Jews as a minority group, which will be not just stopping anti-Semitism, freedom from discrimination, but the positive freedom to have their own schools, to have their own religious courts, to have all kinds of things that we would call legal autonomy. Now, this is, in a nutshell, the kind of story of minority rights out of which international human rights grows after World War II. And it's important because the League of Nations comes along, the precursor to the UN, and ratifies these rights by making all the countries that are created in Eastern Europe write these particular protections into their treaties and into their constitutions. So this is the story of that. Now, it's a complicated story. I'm not going to dwell on it, but it's an interesting one because what Lauterpacht and others say is, you need this not just for us. It's not a special pleading. It's not because we've earned this. It's in fact a better way to administer justice in this very messy, very violent part of the world called Eastern Europe, where in Poland after World War I there are 3 million Jews. There are also several hundred thousand, actually a couple million other Ukrainians and Germans and Lithuanians who also feel that they're at risk of the force of nationalism. So it's acknowledging nationalism and saying we need a better legal system to do it. What does this mean for how we get from this to human rights? And the answer is, Lauterpacht begins to promote this idea of minority rights through what are known as the minorities treaties, as well as to say we need also a homeland over there. And so basically he begins to argue that the way to protect us is with two things, not just one thing. It's not just give us laws here so we can be equal and free. It's also, we're going to need to have a country somewhere where we are the majority and we can have a refuge and a homeland and also a kind of status in the international world. And we don't all have to move there, but we want to have that country. And in a certain sense, Lauterpacht is a lot like many American Jews today who say, we really support this ideal and this necessary thing called a Jewish nation state or Israel over there, whatever you want to call it, but we're not moving there. Right? It's good that it exists, and we identify with it. It helps protect the world of Jews, but it doesn't mean that the only way to be a supporter of it is to move there. And this is what he's saying. It turns out he marries a girl from Jerusalem. He spends a lot of time there. He thinks about moving there, making aliyah. But in the end, he says, I can do the work I want to support it from here, because I'm also working on supporting the Jews in Eastern Europe, the millions of Jews who aren't going there or can't go there and need this protection. So these are the two things. And conceptually, what this really means is that this is a vision that I call Zionist internationalism, in which self-determination goes hand in hand with this idea of protecting Jews in the diaspora as a minority. And this was his work in the 1920s and 30s. This story opens up to a whole bunch of people, and I call these people rooted cosmopolitans, because they think in universal terms about justice, about protection, about human rights, what we would now call human rights. But they're very rooted in their Jewishness, and they see these things as kind of going hand in hand in imagining the world. Now, I talk about this, and I basically, what we can see here is this is a story which is a different story. Human rights don't begin with just the world waking up after World War II and saying, oh my God, there's been a terrible genocide, we need to do something different. And they don't just kind of move slowly out of ancient times as people begin to think about justice. There's this moment of thinking about international law, and it's a moment which is pushed forward by a number of these people who are strongly identified with Jewish nationalism and nationhood. And these people give us much of what we think of as human rights today. Among the people up here is the person who came up basically with the International Refugee Convention. There was another Zionist activist and eventually a diplomat for the Israeli government. People who came up with many of the ideas, as I said, of crimes against humanity, of individual human rights, the whole passel of laws that we think about. Now, at this point, most people who hear me talk about this say, this is a fascinating story, but So then what happened, right? That moment passed, right? And if everything was so obvious that Zionism was part of the story, where did the whole polarization, divergence come from? And most importantly also, why is this completely forgotten? And why is it that all these people who lionize Lauterpacht, he's in the corner of here, fail to recognize that he had this whole other political career and was deeply invested in Israel? And why is it that people in Israel and all these people who are interested in Zionism don't acknowledge all this work that Zionism did on behalf of human rights? If 1948 was the twin birth of these two stories, right, Zionism and human rights, or Israel and human rights, what happened to the twins, right? How did they become so estranged? And why don't we remember it, as I said? So here I want to pivot, and I want to talk for one more minute about Lauterpacht, and then introduce you to the second person I'm going to speak about today, give you a sense of this, because if there's one message I would say, it's that there's no one opinion here. This is a Jewish story, right? There's a lot of different opinions about what went wrong and what everything meant. And there were arguments between these people. And that's what I want to also share a little bit of that with you today. The simplest answer to what changed is politics, right? And interestingly enough, Hirsch Zvi Lauterpacht, as someone present when these things are happening, registered early on a deep unease, even cynicism, about what was going on with international human rights. As I said, this is a man who helps create it, and yet he's cynical. In 1947 and 48, he's cynical because, as a quote up here says, human rights should not be the object of diplomatic bargaining and of political maneuvers. You can't turn it into a political instrument just to criticize one country or just to score political points by saying, well, we believe that our country is the best about this, and therefore we're going to use it for propaganda purposes, so on and so forth. And he goes on to say, we must guard the borderline between law and a most intractable problem of politics. What is he talking about? Well, he's talking about what's going on at the United Nations. And what he sees at the UN in 1947 and 48 is that there are huge fights over how to make these ideals of protection for groups and in individual human rights into actually law. And he says that if we don't get this right, if we don't design the architecture of it right, then it will be susceptible to politicization. In a certain sense, he anticipates exactly what many people decry today, which is that at the UN you can have Iran as the head of the Human Rights Council, or Venezuela. Forget about Israel, forget about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There's a strange thing when autocracies can be involved in promoting themselves as champions of human rights. So back in 47 and 48, Lauterpacht says this is a problem. And he says if we don't lock in and build a better system where countries follow this law up front, then all the norms and all the ideals about the right to education or the right to health care or the right to freedom of speech won't matter, because this isn't a country. Right? We're not talking about the US or England or France or Israel. We're talking about the international sphere. So he's worried about the politics. And the simple way to talk about it is his fear is correct, because the politics do intensify, and they go on from there. In the book, I talk about how we move towards the story of the 50s and then the 60s and the 1967 war. And this is a war where also things begin to intensify and things begin to polarize a little bit more in terms of human rights. What do I mean, and Zionism? What do I mean by that? On the one hand, Israel fights a defensive war and then expands to take over a whole bunch of territory, right? And the question is, what's going to happen with this land and what should happen with it? And some people say, well, there's a peace deal we're going to make, and others, particularly in religious Zionism, begin to develop more messianic ideas. We can't ever do anything with this land but hold it, not because of security, but because it's God-given, and therefore it doesn't matter what the rest of the world says, it's our land, and anyone who's standing there should get out of the way, right? So Zionism itself fractures in a different way and begins to change. But on the other hand, human rights also begins to change. One of the consequences of 1967 is the real emergence of a new form of Palestinian nationalist activism and terrorism. And the Palestinian Liberation Organization says from the get-go, we are a liberation movement and we're a human rights movement. And they use the language of human rights to say, we're fighting for our freedom, which means we can justify using terrorism to pursue it. And this, too, is human rights. So the notion of that begins to change. Undoubtedly, built into this story is also the fact that Israel remains there, and we have the situation where you have legally an occupation. And the question of whose fault it is a secondary one. What I want to argue in the book and what I try to convey to people is that is bound to generate human rights questions. But then, why does the world focus on these questions as opposed to all the other questions out there, right? So there's another answer about politics. And I'm going to mention it briefly for the sake of time. That is the Cold War. Because as it turns out, all these topics I've been describing to you get sucked into the fight between the West and the Soviet Union. And it is the Soviet Union, in point of fact, that begins to develop the idea that Zionism is racism. There are Arab political voices who challenge it and challenge Zionism and say it's not fair. There are those who decry the occupation and denounce it. But the very idea of Zionism racism spreads throughout the global left because of the Soviet Union's work in the 60s and 70s promoting it. And that's an interesting story about why they do it. Essentially, they do it because they have their own anti-Semitism problem and they want to deflect. These are all important things, and we could multiply them, and probably if we opened it up, we could have a vigorous debate about, well, what about this aspect or this aspect? But there's one other dimension to this, and this speaks to the question also of why have we forgotten this earlier history, and why are things so polarized, and given that there is an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, why does it get so much attention versus other conflicts and other problems in the world of human rights around the world? And to make sense of that, I'm going to introduce you briefly to one more person in the story. And this is another person, the person I call the activist, and his name is Peter Benenson. So go back to the slide, and then we zoom into this man, Peter Benenson. Just a quick show of hands. Anyone familiar with this name today? I'm always curious. Peter Benenson. Okay. One person who maybe already saw something in the book, or maybe not. So Peter Benenson is important today because he founded Amnesty International. So if you go back to the opening of what I was talking about, the conflicts between Amnesty International and Israel, there's a very strange and interesting story I tell in the book about Amnesty. Amnesty International is the organization that took human rights global, right? And most people are familiar with it today, but you may not realize that before the 60s, human rights didn't have grassroots groups, right? It was a lot like environmentalism. People cared about conservation. There were some people who were devoted to it. How do we protect nature? How to protect human rights? But there were not movement organizations where you could join and you go to a college campus or you walk downtown DC and somebody walks up to you with a clipboard and says, sign a campaign, sign a petition. Amnesty pioneers this. And they take human rights global, and they also, at the same time, from very early on, get involved in very deep controversies involving Israel. And this question that is still being talked about today. Is it biased against Israel? Is it just doing the work it must do? What's interesting about Amnesty, and the reason this is part of my talk, is that Peter Benenson was born Jewish and grew up in basically the heart of the Zionist movement. He spent his first several years of his life living in Jerusalem in the 1920s. His father was an official working for the British government, Jewish official. His mother was a co-founder of the Women's International Zionist Organization. And she was best friends with a woman named Vera Weitzman, who was the wife of the first president of Israel. This is Peter Benenson as a young boy on vacation with the first president of Israel. His grandfather, and this is there's a news clip I pulled up right there. His grandfather was, for a time, he was basically the first Russian Jewish oligarch. He made money in oil in Baku, before World War I, and his grandfather was, for a time, the single largest donor to the Zionist movement. So I won't bring in contemporary analogies to big donors, but he is that big donor, and he's giving money in the 1920s. Why? To buy land in Palestine for the Jewish National Project. So Peter Benenson grows up in kind of the bosom of Zionist leadership, where the philanthropy and the political leadership, he's in Jerusalem, then he moves with his family to London, and then he goes off to boarding school, and he goes to Eton, and there he finds a mentor, the man on this Time magazine cover, who's a rabbi, who's also a Zionist, Reform rabbi, who's also a Zionist, and he gets involved in youth politics, and then he drops out of boarding school to rescue Jewish children from the Holocaust. And then he begins to get involved in human rights activism and in politics. He becomes a lawyer and then runs for the British Parliament 4 times. And something that's not even in the book, because I just found a very interesting proof of it recently is he, in the early 1950s, is a go-between between the Israeli government, which is a labor-led government, and the British Labour Party. In fact, he is transmitting secret memos between Golda Meir and British labor leaders about the Suez crisis and about whether British labor should be how they can support the Israeli government. So he's in the thick of these things, and yet something happens to him. And what happens to him is, as he is involved in this work, he begins to take a broader look at the Middle East and a broader look at the violence that's happening, not just between Israel and Arab countries, but in Cyprus. He spends a lot of time in Cyprus. He goes to Lebanon. He goes to Egypt. And he sees all over the place violence breaking out. And he sees this violence seems to be because the British Empire is ending, and in its place are new countries rising, but the nationalism of these new countries just leads them into fighting and war. And in fact, he says, human rights don't seem to be doing anything to stop that. We need a new approach. He says human rights is basically impotent. All this warfare in the Middle East, it's still going on. What do we do? And he begins to say, we need to basically get to the root of the matter. And the root of the matter is that nationalism is the enemy. And we need to stop nationalism. So I have this quote up here. And let me just explain what happens to Peter Benenson. He comes home at the end of the 1950s, and he says, I need to do something drastic. And his drastic decision is to say, I need to change my religion. And he converts from Judaism to Catholicism. And then he begins to say, I'm going to invent a new universal kind of religion, basically, and that religion is going to be called Amnesty International, and this is going to be a universal movement to promote human rights by making everyone think like Christians. Now, it's a strange story, to say the least, because here's a person who is deeply embedded in Jewish life, right? He's not somebody that sometimes people say, well, maybe those amnesty people, some of them are Jewish, are self-hating Jews, or they're just people who have no connection to the realities of Jewish life. No, he knows Israel inside and out. His mother is still there. His mother is hanging out with Golda Meir and is going back and forth because she's a very important woman in her own right. He knows this, and he says, nonetheless, we need to think bigger. We need to think about universal way of approaching human rights and humanity. And the way to do it is to think about an organization which will transcend languages and borders and communism and capitalism, all of these things. So for him, human rights isn't just a set of laws to give people the rights they deserve and to protect them. It's a new way to kind of reform humanity. And this is why he says in his writings, we have to use religion to do it, because religion, in particular Catholicism, has an idea of a universal church. Now, what does it mean to speak about a universal church? He does not say everyone should convert to Christianity with me. He does not say I now hate Jews or I hate Muslims. He says I want everyone to just think like Christ and imagine themselves and basically almost take the ideals of this religion and bring them together. And the person that I think he's most like, I always tell my students this, and they say, wait, you're a Jewish history professor. Why are you talking about Jesus and Paul? And I say they're part of Jewish history. He's a lot like Paul, the first century apostle, who was a Jew who converts to Christianity and becomes the leading apostle of this new religion. And Paul has a very famous line where he says, there's neither Jew nor Greek. There's neither free nor slave. There's neither male nor female. There's only one humanity, all united in Christ. And it's actually a beautiful idea of universal humanity without nations, without countries, right? Without the stuff that divides people. And the idea is this version of this religion is going to promote that. And basically, Peter Benenson begins to take these ideas too. And like Paul, he also begins to say the nationalism out there, which is dangerous, has to stop. And the first people who should stop it are my own people. Meaning all nationalisms are bad. But the one I know best is Jewish nationalism, and therefore that's the one I'm going to focus the most attention on. So this is a kind of deep theological move, but it underlies a lot of what Amnesty goes on to do. And here I always stop and say, I'm not arguing that Amnesty is anti-Semitic. I know many people have worked in the leadership about Jews and non-Jews, but it means that we can begin to see why this aspect of the human rights movement begins to focus so much on Israel and on the question of human rights there, and begins to think of Zionism as sort of a uniquely demonic or bad form of nationalism. because the Jews should be the ones to give it up first, because they're the ones who have suffered and because they're the ones who should kind of see the light. Now, Peter Benenson goes on to have a complicated relationship with Israel, to say the least, because he begins to say things publicly like, I used to be a Zionist. I still think there should be an Israel. Fine, there could be a country, but I basically reject what it's become. Right? And he goes on to say, we should focus our attention on their sins first, because this is the part of the world that requires it. And then many other people, including other Jewish leaders, say, Peter, why are you so focused on this? What about the Soviet Union? What about China? What about Egypt? And then he will often say, we care about those too, but we have to focus here. So something begins to take hold, and begins to take hold of the way some human rights activists, some, not all, focus on this. And this also begins to foment a certain type of amnesia, that Zionism might have played a different role in the story of human rights before this period, or might continue to after that. So where does this all leave us? From that moment in the 60s and 70s, things intensify more and more, and this polarization sets in. And you begin to see people argue that to be for human rights is to be against Zionism. And it begins to acquire a certain focus, status, as the thing you need to oppose. And this is what happens. Now, at the same time, and whether it's in reaction to it or because of Zionism itself, you see people on the Jewish right and the Zionist right begin to say that human rights itself is just the enemy. And so when people create human rights organizations, they begin to say, well, we know they're all anti-Semitic. They don't even know about Peter Benenson necessarily and his strange backstory, but they begin to say this is just polar opposite to what we represent. And this certain amnesia sets in, and I think it also is something which is, it's never just about the Jews. It's something about a larger situation in our world today, where we now have a situation in which people will demonize globalism or cosmopolitans and attack that as something bad, or they'll demonize nationalism, all nationalism, and say it itself is just the enemy of human rights, rather than something that could take many forms and become many things. I call this sort of a tragedy of double amnesia, and I think it's a tragedy which is a price that comes with it, making it very difficult for us to think through this. Because then when we imagine the conflict, it's always, but what about them and their bias against us, if we speak on behalf of Israel? Or on the other side, well, look at Zionism, look what it's doing, right? Look at this administration, look at this, look at Zionism. Well, Zionism seems to be always saying these things and doing these things. And those images are basically, they calcify and they become extreme polar images, which makes it much harder to remember other points in time where these things worked hand in hand, where people felt they could fight for Jewish survival and freedom and fight for human rights, and they could blend the two together. If this is the challenge today, and many of these images and the things I'm evoking are the challenges that are all too well known, what's the solution? Well, here's where I say we all should study history, right? Because this history and these people's lives can show us, first of all, that it was possible to not agree on stuff and to have tensions within them, but to still push forward bold new ideas. These are a couple images that represent different faces of it, that you can imagine different paths forward by looking backward. This is on here is a postage stamp from 1958, when the United Nations celebrated the 10th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They asked countries to help promote it, and Israel stepped in and put together a postage stamp which says, "Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Right? It's a classic line, it's a core line that we value in the Jewish tradition, and for them it was fully consonant with the United Nations and with what Zionism meant for this government at that time. So it was possible to do that, and suffice to say, I don't think you could imagine that happening today. For Israel. On the right or the left, frankly, because of the way in which many people now view what the UN has become. So recovering this doesn't give us a kind of a golden age where everything made sense and there were no conflicts. There were conflicts. And one of the things I often emphasize is that many of the people in the book, not just the amnesty people, but this earlier figure, Lauterpacht, he had a lot to say about Palestinians and their rights. He had a lot to say about what the question of this conflict is and what law can do and can't do. And it didn't stop him from pushing forward with these different activities that were, in his mind, kind of blended or braided together, as opposed to, well, I do my support for Israel over here, and then I do my human rights over here. He dared to think that they could go together. And I think this is a very powerful idea for our moment when we struggle precisely with what does it mean to belong to a nation, and even an American nation, that has borders and struggles with those borders and wants to come up with a way for balancing ideals of internationalism and nationhood, of security and freedom. How do we think about that? And maybe the starting point is to move past some of these dichotomies and polar opposites, as well as the idea that for many young people you have to choose between being Jewish-oriented or for humanity. Maybe you don't have to do that, and maybe these people can give us something of an example, because they're people who see themselves as rooted and cosmopolitan, hence rooted cosmopolitans. So my closing idea to leave you with is just that if we want to chart a future for human rights and for Jewish politics, for what it will mean, what we imagine Israel to look like, what it could look like, we could start by looking back in the past and seeing how these people traveled this road and the ideas they brought with them. Thank you. So obviously I welcome your questions. We have a little time for some Q&A and.
Yeah, well, just before we do that, we have this little tradition of allowing people to think up their questions.
Oh, great.
We'll pass around mics so people can directly speak with Dr. Loeffler yourselves and ask your questions, but we have to take a moment for a promo.
Promo, always promo.
Our promo. So our regular promo, just to keep you posted, we have 4 more lectures this year. And on March 3rd, former New York Times journalist Steve Weissman will present The Chosen Wars, How Judaism Became an American Religion. He looks at the transformation of Judaism in America and how America, the new homeland, gave rise to fresh inspiration to the religion. Toward the end of the month, American Israeli entrepreneur Tal Kainan will be here on March 31st to talk about his book, God is in the Crowd, 21st Century Judaism. He's an American-born former fighter pilot with the Israeli Air Force who will bring his financial experience to bear in an analysis of why the world number of Jews is decreasing and what we can do to stem that tide. In April, we will have a program looking at the late Nobel laureate, author, activist Elie Wiesel, who himself spoke in the Scholar Series years ago. And we'll have 2 authors who knew him well to share their reminiscences. Rabbi Ariel Berger, who was his teaching assistant at Boston University, and Nadine Epstein, editor-in-chief of Moment magazine, which Elie Wiesel helped to found in 1975. And our final program of the year, which we will celebrate with a reception, will be on May 15th with activist and CNN commentator Sally Cohen presenting The Opposite of Hate, a field guide to repairing our humanity. She explores the ugliness and dissension erupting around us in the world and seeks answers for today as to how to surmount it. So now I invite everyone to raise your hands if you'd like the mic to ask a question.
Oh, that was easy. Well, thank you very much. I must say I'm 100% in agreement with what you said, but I wonder how you can apply it to what's happening now in Israel. In 1948, not only was the State of Israel formed, but there was an offer to create an Arab state as well, split Palestine. It was rejected. Arab community invaded without consulting taking the publicity how the Palestinians fought about it outside. It was a replay in 1967, to which the loss was responded with the Khartoum Agreement, Khartoum Conference, carry on the fight. The Gaza Strip, give Gaza as a way, and it becomes a base to fight Israel. The reaction now in Israel by the right is to is not to reach out to the Palestinians, but to settle the West Bank, making a two-state solution impossible. No, so how do we go and how do we deal with this?
Sure. I'll just put up a different slide so we have go back to the first one. Thank you for the question. Yes, so the question I think is a very important question. I'm just going to go back to the beginning here. Actually, let me just go to here so you can see some of these people as we talk.
You go on too long.
So yes, how do we apply it to today, and how do we also take into account that there are a lot of events that happen which aren't simply about legal ideas or ideals, but this is about the reality of what happened in the wars, right? So here's what I would say. One of the biggest challenges, and I talk about this in the book, is understanding what went wrong. And I think it was not just that there was a war and then Zionism changed and human rights changed. Most of these people imagined in 1948 there was going to be what we would call a two-state solution. So the question, as you mentioned, they imagined the land is going to be divided up. There'll still be Arabs who live in a Jewish country, and there might still be Jews living in an Arab country, but it'll be divided up. And they also believed once we do that, there's kind of a symmetry to the world, and we're gonna still have arguments and conflicts, but there's going to be a symmetry. And many of them were disappointed when that didn't happen. They said, well, that's because the Arabs didn't accept and invaded. And they hoped and waited for the peace to come, and it didn't, right? And they hoped and waited in '67, and it didn't come. And they assumed once we get that, all of these other messy issues are going to resolve themselves. So many people are skeptical that will come, and others say we still need to get to that today. I think the key thing is this. Inside Israel, how do you keep alive that sense of hope and possibility and not simply make it impossible to have a two-state solution at some point, right, which we still hope to get to peace? One of the problems is that reacting to this sense of it's never going to change, it's never going to be resolved, and no matter what we do, the rising anti-Semitism in the world seems to target Israel and target Jews. Many people have begun to say the problem is human rights organizations, even in our own country, right? And so when those organizations, which are basically the equivalent to liberal human rights groups here, calling out policies and challenging government policy and saying, but what about the rights of Palestinians right now? Those groups are now being demonized. And it needs to be noted, they're being demonized as if they are the enemy, and their funding should be cut off because they are all agents of foreign powers determined to destroy the state. And that has a very negative, corrosive effect on civil society there, which means people have become more and more cynical about they become more and more like us. I hate to say it. They become more and more polarized and also cynical about everything is politics, and you can't believe anything, and everything is fake news. And this has taken over a lot of Israeli society. What I think we need to do is empower those voices in Israeli society who want to preserve democratic norms and want to preserve ideals and possibilities for peace along with security. And those people feel increasingly challenged to kind of respond to a litmus test. Do you denounce this? Do you denounce that? Which I don't think makes for a healthy politics. So this doesn't give us the blueprint for that. But it does say that given how much Zionism was invested in building human rights and acknowledging all the problems with some of the bias inside the human rights movement, it doesn't mean we have to dismiss all of it. Maybe we should call out that bias, but then point back to this and say it was entirely possible for the Labor Party, and in fact, some of these people were center-right in Israeli politics. Some of these people were identified with political parties that were represented the center and the right in Israeli politics, and they were standing on that position. So I think that is something we can use to kind of de-escalate the way in which it has now become such a polarized political culture in Israel. A couple years ago, I was invited to a conference on the history of Zionism. And the conference, it could have been one of these slides. It was co-sponsored by the Jewish Agency, which is a semi-governmental organization that coordinates with Jewish communities worldwide to support Israel, and an organization called the New Israel Fund. New Israel Fund works to promote civil liberties and pluralism inside Israel. Many people on the right view it as way too pro-Palestinian, way too lefty. Others think it's doing the work of civil society. Suffice it to say that when the poster appeared that advertised these two groups, one the Jewish Agency and New Israel Fund on it. I know a very, very famous academic, I won't mention his name, pulled out. And this guy is a left-wing scholar, politically identified with the left. He said, I don't want my name to appear on this conference program if that organization is there because I'll be attacked. And I went recently to Israel and spoke there, and a friend of mine I know there said, yeah, you know, I have so many friends who give to different civil liberties, civil rights, human rights groups in Israel, but they will never put their name on it. These are left-wing people, won't put their name on it because they're afraid they're going to be attacked because it's so polarized there. Now, there may be reasons to criticize some of these organizations, but I think we have reached a point of very corrosive politics, and I think what we need to do is recognize that they are not necessarily the enemy, even if they are doing what we like. So that, I think, is something, because otherwise we can't account for what the Palestinians will or won't do. We can't account for the Arab world's choices. But we can keep alive democratic norms and a kind of commitment to nationhood and these other values as we're waiting for the moment of opportunity for peace. So there's my stump speech. Please, yeah.
I thoroughly enjoyed reading your book, and in fact, I bought it for our daughter, who is an Israeli diplomat, who is now involved with the struggle for human rights. My question has to do with Jacob Blaustein.
Yes.
I know you can't talk a lot about all five of the people that you mentioned, but I was surprised because he came from the oil industry.
Yeah.
How he became so influential, and I wonder if you could just expand on that a little bit.
Sure. Well, you've done the best thing an author could ask for, which is say there's more to read in the book. There are many people in the book, even beyond the five. Morris Abram is another important person in the book who plays a role in this story and succeeded Jacob Blaustein in the leadership of the American Jewish Committee, one of the organizations I talk about, and in American public affairs and diplomacy. So Blaustein, as you all may know this name, legendary in Baltimore and in American Jewish public affairs. And yes, he was an immigrant kid with his immigrant father who worked his way up in the pioneered gas stations and in the oil and gas business, and then slowly built up until suddenly he was a tycoon in the oil business along with all these other Texans. And it was an odd position to find himself as a Jewish boy from Baltimore because then, as now, much of that industry was built on a connection between Saudis and Texans. And here's this Jewish guy coming in. And to make matters perhaps worse, he's very involved in Jewish life, proudly committed to it. And after Israel is created, he's somebody who is very interesting and important for our day, actually, because he's not an anti-Zionist, but he's not a Zionist. But once Israel is created, he realizes this is really important for Jewish security, and we should support it, and we should push for peace. So his story is in the book, and suffice it to say, he managed to play these different roles, to juggle these different things, and to say, I can go to the Arab world and talk to them, and we can negotiate. And I can say, I know you're publicly going to attack Israel and this and that, but probably we have some common interests here. So he is like many people today who say there's a lot more out there that behind the scenes that we can recognize as possible. And so we can read more about him in the book.
Here we go.
Yeah, where's the mic? Yeah.
Hi, I want to focus in on 1967 as a date because it seems like we sort of skipped over the practical political implications of the year, right? You told a story about intellectual entrepreneurs, about people coming up with new ideas. But what happened in 1967 was the shift between an inclusive and sort of self-determinationist Zionism into a Zionism as an occupying force of an actively controlling another national self-determination movement. And so it seems to me that that would create a natural break, one in which you would really start to have to see that there was a contrast and tension, more tension than there was before between Zionism and human rights. So I'm wondering to what extent people like Benenson and the broader human rights movement were motivated by the birth of the occupation rather than sort of, you know, conversions to Christianity and other sort of stuff like that.
That's a powerful question. It's an important question. So I think 67 is very important. And for the sake of covering, as you all can tell, there's a lot of information in this book, and I'm interested in particularly the ideas of these people and their motivations. But I don't discount the power of that as changing things. So some of the people in the book say everything has changed. we suddenly, it's not simply about our self-determination. We have power, and the Palestinians are under our rule, right? And so Zionism is going to have to decide what it's going to become, right? What it wants to be. And those people have different opinions about it. What's important, I think, to mention and to kind of, from my perspective, what's important for the human rights movement is the following. Amnesty International has a real dilemma after '67, and the dilemma is as follows. Amnesty, from its founding, says we want to be neutral on politics. We don't care if it's the U.S. or the USSR. We just want to represent people who've been unfairly imprisoned, political prisoners. And one of our key things is we don't work in war zones, and we don't work on political prisoners who have used or endorsed violence. So famously or infamously, Amnesty International refuses to support Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela is part of an armed struggle. He's also a freedom fighter and a human rights hero. And Amnesty has a huge debate internally about this because they say, well, how can we not support him? Apartheid is wrong. But on the other hand, it violates our core belief if we're going to be consistent. And what happens after '67 is a similar debate about what's just happened with the Israel victory and its occupation. And everyone calls it an occupation, even if those who view it as, it's important to announce this today, even those who view it as Jewish reclamation of sovereign historic land, right? Legally, the Israeli government has never wavered from saying this is technically a state of war and this is a military occupation. The argument then is, until that ends, until there's a resolution, what should be the status of those people, Palestinians, as well as Israelis who move into that area. So what does Amnesty do after that war? They have a huge debate, and some people say, this is a war zone, and we're hearing reports of human rights violations. And there's a bigger issue because the Palestinians say they want self-determination. How can we not weigh in on this? We're a human rights group. And other voices say, because we don't deal with violence or people who espouse violence, and these prisoners are Fatah prisoners. So they're part of an armed struggle. So we may sympathize with their dilemma, but if we do that, we risk getting involved in something we're not equipped to do, and we risk losing our neutrality. And so a big debate ensues from that. And the long and short of it is they go in and they try and do an investigation, and they say, we have to do this. And the investigation leads to a blow-up in which the American branch of Amnesty says, we disavow the mothership, the international organization, because you are hopelessly anti-Israel. And others say, this is exactly what this organization must do. We must change with the times because this is a new situation here. And especially, we should care about it. So I think it's important, and I often say to people who come more from the right on this, to say these groups do struggle with this. They struggle with what's the right thing to do. The reason I think that '67 isn't only about Israel wins this territory and then they rule it in occupation, is that as people at the time argue, including the people from the Israeli branch of Amnesty, who say, call us out on all the bad things we're doing, but don't single us out and not address evenly all the other issues of other countries around here. So they raise the question and they raise the criticism that is often raised by critics today of Amnesty or human rights groups. Yes, there's an occupation, but why does it get so much focus? And that is where I'm looking for the deeper reasons. And as I've said before, that's not because of anti-Semitism, but it may be because of the moral imagination of what we care about. And some of those people, those voices say, we do care about what's going on, but this is a very difficult situation where we're facing terrorist violence, but we also recognize these people are now under our rule. And that's the position of many, I think, on the left in Israel today, which is to say there are terrorists there, and there are human rights violations. And now what do we struggle with? But other parts of Amnesty say we no longer have patience for this, right? We're a human rights group. This is a universal mission. We know stuff is happening there. We want to focus on it. So my goal is to try and unpack it and see how they reason. Because as one Israeli activist says at the time, if it just becomes a popularity contest, if human rights becomes a popularity contest, we'll lose. Because we'll look bad, and because the other side looks, whether or not it is always weaker, it looks like David and we're Goliath. And we can't afford to do that because we will lose legitimacy in our own society, and it's just not fair. So that's the thing. '67 changes a lot. But it also exacerbates some of these tensions and leads to these really interesting dilemmas. And I basically say we've been living in a loop since that moment onwards, where every time a human rights group wants to report on this, they say, well, we want to do this, and then Israel says, how are you going to trust Hamas to tell you what's really going on, or even the Palestinian Authority? They have political agendas. And then Amnesty or Human Rights Watch says, well, we have to. We have researchers. We have allegations. That's our job. Our job isn't to make you look good. Our job is to seek out and figure out what's going on. And that begins after the '67 war. And I think that actually people acquire roles in that story, where these groups begin to say, we're never going to trust the Israelis. They're always going to lie because they're always opposing us. And the possibilities for another model sort of slip away.
So I just have a question. I have to admit that I worked for the American Jewish Committee while I was going to law school, and worked for Hyman Bookbinder for years.
Sure.
Who taught me a lesson. And the lesson is when all the evangelicals were making friends with us.
Yeah.
And his lesson was, be careful who you think your friends are. And why are they your friends? So you talked about a war zone. And so I have to admit that I believe that I now live in a war zone. I live in America. As a Jew, I believe I live in a war zone. Makes me sorry. And I happen to be a lawyer who represents Muslims at the time. I'm a divorce lawyer. So one of the Christians wrote on Facebook that I was the Jew lawyer who looked like a vulture. I actually thought vulture was a compliment, but and how could I represent Muslims?
Right.
And the sense is that, and Christians say this to me, they have no idea of history. And one of the problems we live in, so as American Jews now, I actually believe I live in a war zone. I actually believe, as an American Jew, for the first time, and I grew up here, for the first time in my life, feel like a minority. Never thought of myself as a minority because I live here. So what do we as Jews now do about this? When we ourselves live in a war zone, in which we have somebody in the White House who gets up and says the most outrageous things, and the thing about Pelosi yesterday to me is very frightening, because we live in a country with guns. So what do we do about civil rights and human rights?
Yeah, thank you. There are very difficult questions for American Jews today here, right? And I think you're right to raise this question about what does this have to do with our reality? Forget about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What do we do with anti-Semitism today and the strange alliances and the strange things that would have appeared? So I would say there's maybe two quick lessons we can take from this. One is that these people were willing to make alliances and partnerships and with people that they recognize as radically different from them. So it's striking here that Jews and Germans are working on what I would call human rights in the 1920s, before the Nazis take power. And there are other Jews who say, how can you even work with Germans? Like, how could you trust these people? So alliances and solidarity networks are a very big question for American Jews today. And the answer is, it was possible to do these things. Even, I would say, even in the 60s, it's striking that some of these people at the UN would say, well, I know I'm locked in a fight with Arab diplomats, but we also actually have some common interests. We can still work on certain issues together for human rights. And there was a certain belief that it's possible to vehemently disagree and still do things together. That's kind of a generic response. More specifically, I do think there's some very powerful ideas in this history, and some of the writing I'm doing, I'm working slowly on a new article, which might be a book at some point, about how to fight anti-Semitism with law. Some of these people thought there are actually other laws that we could use in America to fight anti-Semitism in the 1950s and 60s, and they argued with the American Jewish Committee and with the World Jewish Congress, the American Jewish Congress, about First Amendment issues, about things such as how to stop anti-Semitism and hate speech. These are things perhaps worth re-exploring today, because we are in a different moment and we can't assume that Jews won't be targeted, and they'll be targeted either for who they are or for who they are identifying with or supporting. So I agree with you that we need to think about how to do that, and part of it is don't assume we haven't been here before. I'm in Bookbinder. These people worked through these issues. When Jews worked in the civil rights movement, they faced incredible domestic pressures, and they had to figure out how do we do that, and how do we do that to protect ourselves and others.
Here we go.
Yeah.
The question before, you talked a little bit about the changes in the human rights movement based on the '67. And you've indicated that it's an evolutionary activity. Do you see any evidence now that human rights are changing with respect to Israel and Palestine, changing from a focus on the human rights problems with respect to the occupation and the treatment of Palestinians in occupied lands, to, in some instances, the issue of the right of existence of Israel itself.
Sure. Everything is changing. A lot of different things are happening. There are clearly some human rights groups who are realizing, especially because of global anti-Semitism, that we have to take a more nuanced position on Israel. We have to be aware of what's going on there, and we have to find ways to partner with it, even though we may have a deep ideological disagreement about the Palestinian question. So there is that happening in the human rights world. There are also new human rights groups appearing. And I'll tell you something that's very striking. I was just in Israel. There are now many conservative, politically conservative human rights groups that are appearing in Israel saying, we care about human rights. We want to help Israeli Arabs and we want to help Palestinians. We're not going to get into questions about the occupation, but we're going to help promote their human rights on like a day-to-day level as Zionists. And in a certain sense, they're saying this is a model for us. There are also lots of other human rights groups which are conservative groups who want to promote all kinds of other things, such as right to life in Europe. This is a huge issue for the Russian Orthodox Church, Catholic groups. So they're saying we do human rights too, and they're kind of muddying the waters, but in a sense they're bringing a commitment to human rights with a slightly different focus in, and showing up at the UN and saying we want to be involved in this too, and we don't want to simply have Amnesty speak for all human rights people. So that is complicating the situation. Whether where that will lead, we don't know exactly. I was at a conference and this was being discussed, and people were screaming. This, as you can imagine, Israeli professors saying that's not human rights. If you support the occupation, you're not a human rights group. And other people were saying, who are you to say? These people absolutely believe in human rights, but they say it's our land over there. So human rights is okay for the Palestinians. We just don't want to give them political self-determination. That's a weird thing for many of us to process, but it's going on. On the other hand, what is definitely happening is that Palestinian human rights groups are trying to figure out what they want to do. And should they tie their claims for freedom in the context of the occupation to the status of the 20% of Israel's population that is Arab? And should they say we're one Palestinian nation that needs self-determination or some kind of rights? Or should they say, no, this is over here and this is over here? There's a lot going on. I couldn't quite predict where it's going. I think everyone is doing some reckoning with this. I think one thing I would say is there's often a gap between these professional organizations and what they wrestle with and the people you hear screaming on the news, right? So these organizations, actually, some of them have come to me and said, we want to talk to you about this because we have a problem. We've got an Israel problem. Maybe you can give us some help to make it better. But on the other hand, I work on a campus where you see all the slogans trotted out, and Jewish students come to me and say, I'm as left as you can be on Israel. I'm like a J Street left-wing person who thinks the occupation is terrible, and they won't let me join the Human Rights Coalition because they say you're a Zionist, right? So the rhetoric is intensifying and worsening in many spheres of activism in the human rights world, but that is not necessarily the same as these organizations which recognize, perhaps even going back to the question, the last question, wow, we're really in a different world today. Things are very different in American politics, and maybe we should stop focusing only on, kind of a certain tunnel vision and try and figure out a different way to approach this.
Here we go. Sir.
Yeah.
Hi. We go back to 1948, and I don't know if you can connect links between the Declaration of State in Israel, the Declaration of Human Rights in the UN, and Eleanor Roosevelt.
Sure. Read the book. No. No. Those things are happening together, and this is what I would say, and maybe this is just a way to close. What is very clear is that actually the Universal Declaration and the Declaration of Independence for Israel assume the same thing. They assume that having a nation state is a good way, and the world, there should be no empires, and people should have their own countries, And they're not all going to be wedged into one country, but they're going to be countries, and countries should all behave with a certain template. And in fact, most of the rights described in the Universal Declaration are already provided in Israel, even without a constitution from the founding. They imagine the same thing, a world of states. What they both struggle with is a world in which not everybody has a state, and there are stateless people. And the dilemma is exactly the dilemma today, which is to say they imagine that the Arabs will create a state on the other side of the border for the Palestinians. And when it doesn't appear, they're kind of stuck, because what do you do with these people? Well, they should go somewhere else. And then this debate is, what state should they belong to? And they say, we don't want to go somewhere else, right? And we're back in the debates about Palestinians and Israelis. They imagine, however, that the world will fit, and they also imagine that everyone is going to go somewhere. And so when we have other challenges, like millions of people who flee Syria, and where are they supposed to go? And countries in Europe say, well, we'll take them, but we can't actually take them, right? 1948, they didn't really have a good solution for that. They imagined that, well, everyone belongs somewhere, and eventually everyone is sorted out. But as we see, we're in a new era of millions and millions of people on the move and displaced from their countries, Iraq, Yazidis, all kinds of people. And the challenge is, where do they belong? It's the challenge that Leslie opened up with, when you have people coming to our borders, migrants, and we struggle with exactly what is the humane way to bring them into this country. And you can see that many people say they must have another country of their own. In 1948, everyone assumed the world would be neatly ordered. And now we don't live in that world anymore. So we have to see, what can we take from that and what can we imagine forward as a better solution.
So that brings me to one last question that I wanted to ask you is, in the face of the war zone, in the face of what's going on the borders and the rise of nationalism around the world, how do you view the efficacy, the future, or the importance of the United Nations today?
Sure. Wow, okay. You're not giving me an easy one to end with, Leslie. I think it's never been more essential, never been weaker. The problem with the UN is that it's necessary as a place for people to do the business of dialogue and negotiation, debate in an ordered manner. It's weak because it is not. We've recognized with these wars that to stop wars, you sometimes often need armies to stop wars, and the UN doesn't do that. And we also recognize that we want law to do a certain work, but much of the UN law doesn't really have the teeth to do it. So we need it as a structure, but it almost is counterproductive because it inflates a lot of people's hopes that it can do certain things and doesn't deliver it. If you'll indulge me, I'm going to close on one note and go against myself here and say, though, that I think where there is a sense of possibility is in the return of religion in a lot of ways. And because I just always like to end on a more positive note. But I think one thing that's striking is we don't all have to think like Christians to save human rights the way Peter Benenson did. But we're now in a world in which we struggle with these things, and religion and some of the resources in the Jewish tradition and other traditions can be very useful. What I think would be helpful, for instance, is to shift from a model of just rights to duties. Because then we can say, what do we owe each other? What do we owe the migrant at the border? What do we owe the Palestinian? What does he owe the Israeli? That might be something that is woven into the Jewish tradition when we talk about our obligations, less in terms of the rights. Because what the UN can't do is realize those rights. It can announce them, it can advertise them, it can make us feel good about them, but it can't force countries to do that. So maybe if we look for other realms of inspiration, including communities like this, we can find a language of obligation which can help us think forward.
Well, thank you so very, very much. Really.
Thank you.
Terrific analysis. Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope everyone will stop by Lainey's table there and pick up the book. It is a beautiful and human approach to the subject because the five people come alive in the great immediacy about the moments and the decisions and the challenges that they faced. So it is far from a dry read. It is really personal and takes you into the moment and the mood, and is beautifully, beautifully written. So also pick up back there copies of our schedule of upcoming lectures. And thank you all so much for coming, and thank you
Thank you
so
Leslie.
very much.
Pleasure. Thank you.